Today we're going to continue our series that we started last week, and that is John, the miracles of John. It's hard to say the miracles of John, the miracles from John, the miracle, because we know it's not John, it's Jesus. So maybe I should say the sermon series should be miracles from Jesus written by John, to be more accurate. But anyway, that's what we're dealing with. And so today we're going to go to John chapter 6. In John chapter 6, we're talking about when your resources are low. And again, I've shared this message, and it's going to be different than the way that I shared it. You can talk about the stories of Jesus over and over again, and you can present them from a different perspective. I think that's why the Gospels, when you think about it, all of them are really covering the same thing, but they all look to the cross from a different angle, a different perspective. And depending on where you look from, you see different things. And that's what we're doing with this. We want to not just look at the miracles, but we want to look at the conversations that took place that led to the miracle. What is that conversation that puts people in a place to receive the miracle of God? Or what is it that Jesus is teaching us in that conversation that precedes the miracle of God? Because the reality is, like today's miracle that we're going to look at, the feeding of the 5,000, I'm not sure everybody got it. There are some people that just thought this was an ordinary fish fry. And it was just a meal. They missed it. They weren't looking at the details. They didn't see what happened. They probably didn't even realize what Jesus started with. And so as far as they're concerned, when you're not looking, you miss things. And we don't want to do that because, you miss out on the blessing of God. And so we want to turn our attention to John chapter 6, verse 1. We've entitled this, When Your Resources Are Low. Ever been there? Resources low? You know what I'm talking about, right? When you get your paycheck and you look at it, in fact, looking at your pay stub just is a discouraging thing. Because before you ever got what's yours, the government got what's theirs, usually. And you look at, and there's a big lesson you learn early on as an employee. There's a big difference between gross and net. Gross and net. You can't live on gross. You live on net. And it just seems like the net gets smaller and smaller as time goes. And then, you put it into the bank account, and then you start piling up the bills. And you start hoping that you're still going to have some net left when all of the bills are paid so that you can live. Look, we've all been there. And what I've learned is it doesn't matter how much you make. It seems like everybody has the attitude it's never enough. I remember I thought, when I could just make this much, boy, that'll be just, oh man, I'll have to look for things to spend my money on. And then you get there and you realize, it didn't go quite the way I thought. If I could just have this, and if I could just have that. The reality is, you can't control what you make a lot of times. Even if you own a business, you can work real hard, and sometimes you go to the mailbox and you don't get paid today. A big part of my life was like that, where, the mailman came to deliver my money, and sometimes it just seemed like he was hiding stuff. And can you go back out in your truck and look again? I'm expecting this. And, they said it's in the mail. And of course, if they said it's in the mail, it had to have been in the mail. I've learned that people don't always mean what they say when they do things like that. So there are times in our life when we're low in resources, and I don't want this to be just a financial thing, because it's not that. It's low. There's resources that we can run low of all of our life. What I've really enjoyed this past week, reading the book of Ephesians. By the way, we missed you in our life group, Charmaine. Just so powerful that God is rich, and He's not just rich, He's exceedingly rich. He's rich in mercy. It uses these adjectives that remind us, while we live in an attitude of lack in a lot of these areas of grace and mercy and love and kindness and all that God is rich. I mean, really rich in these things that really matter. And so today we're going to look at the experience of Jesus. Jesus was preaching to the multitudes, and boy, what a great preacher he must have been. because people would sit hour after hour waiting and hanging on the next words that would fall from his lips, because in that they found hope and life and encouragement and all of that. And Jesus preached. I mean, he preached and preached and preached. I mean, there are places where it looks like the guy preached all day long. I mean, several hours, day after day. Talk about camp meeting. That's what it was. And so in this story, we have thousands of people that have been listening to Christ for days. Days. Now, not that he preached for days, but he took a break. They went to bed. They got up. And when they woke up, he started preaching again. You know, once you started Jesus talking about certain things, he didn't want to be quiet. He wanted to tell people about the love of God and what the kingdom of heaven was like. And so he was out in the wilderness for a few days. And the people had been so attentive. They're in the boondocks, is what we call it in Oklahoma. I don't know what you call it here, because there isn't any of it here, I've learned. You're driving down the street, and you're in one city, and you cross the street, and you're in another city. I'm used to, they're spread out where I come from. There's a lot of vacant land in between before you go into that. And that's kind of what this was. This was out on the hillside, out in the wilderness, where there was nothing to provide for them. Everyone was starving. The demand was high and the resources were low. And before the people perished, this is the story of what Jesus did. John chapter 6, verse 1, he says, "And after these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Then a great multitude followed him, because they saw his signs which he performed on those that were diseased. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there sat with his disciples. Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, 'Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?' But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may eat a little. One of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, 'There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. But what are they among so many?' Then Jesus said, 'Make the people sit down.' Now there was much grass in the place. So the men sat down and numbered about 5,000. Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and to the disciples those sitting down, and likewise the fish, as much as they wanted. So when they were filled, he said to the disciples, 'Gather up the fragments that remain, so that nothing is lost.' Therefore they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments and 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten." Wow, quite a story, isn't it? And if you're not careful, you just miss the significance of God doing something, not for the benefit of Jesus, not for the benefit of the disciples, but Jesus cares about the people. He looked, he saw compassion, and he wanted to do something. Friends, I have news for you, that God knows your needs. He knows your needs before you know them. Before you ever really recognize that you're in a terrible place, God knows what is happening, and God cares about those details in your life. And here's what I've learned. That it doesn't matter what is going on in my life, what kind of chaos, what kind of unexpected things happen in my life, when I reach a place when I'm looking at that, often I'm almost helpless. I mean, I don't know what to do. And this story reminds us that in the face of any circumstance in your life, God has a plan. God always has a plan. Jesus has promised to be with you always, and there is nothing that will catch him unaware. Nothing catches him by surprise. Again, I want to tell you one of my favorite things that's plastered in my mind and everywhere I can stick it, and it's simply this: there is no panic in the throne room of God. As God looks over your situation, He is not caught unaware. He is not panicking. He is not desperately trying to find an answer to the problem that you're facing. God has no problem seeing what is best in every situation. So there's no panic in the throne room. Therefore, there should be no panic in the bedroom. There should be no panic in the kitchen or the den or anywhere else, because you are a child of God. That God is watching over you. And He knows that you don't know the answer, but He does. You know, in this story, it might have seemed that Jesus was facing a problem. It might have seemed that Jesus lacked the resources that would be necessary to provide the need for the moment. It might have seemed that Jesus didn't know what to do. I mean, He kind of tees it up that way. He sees the need, and rather than just providing for the need, He stops. And the reason is Jesus is a great teacher. He's been preaching about the kingdom of heaven. He's been preaching and teaching for days. The disciples have been with Him for some time now, and every once in a while a good teacher knows you got to do a test. You got to have a quiz. You got to stop. And it's not just for his or her benefit that the teacher gives the test, but it's for the student. Am I growing in this area? Am I learning to master these spiritual lessons? Friends, God sends tests in your spiritual life, and you need to be ready for them, because it is part of what God does. And so we're looking at this story about what to do when your resources are getting low. Here's the first thing. Be a good manager, even if it's a small amount. Too many people face a situation where they lack something. They lack, and obviously here it's food and material resources, but it's other things as well. And they lack, they don't feel like they have enough. And so the immediate thought is, the answer to my problem is more of something. And I have learned that unless you can learn to manage a little, you will never be able to manage a lot. God teaches this principle that he that is faithful in a little will be given much. In other words, as we show faithfulness in the little things of life, God knows then that we can be trusted with more. But we would say, God, I'm going to wait until I have a lot, and then I'm going to start exercising good stewardship. Let me tell you something. It doesn't take, well, I'm going to say this, and then I'm going to disagree with myself in a minute, so to hear me out. It doesn't take a good steward to manage a lot, at least in our mind. We think if we just had all that we could stand, then we could be a good steward. Look, I've shared a little bit about my personal journey. I wanted to be rich when I was a little kid. I was a very material person. I would get an allowance, and my parents would say I would hoard it. I would literally sit in the corner of the room counting it every way I could, stacking it, doing whatever. I used to be the one that when the family was going out to dinner that night, I would have the nerve to say to my mother and father, if I stay here, can I have the money that you are going to spend on my meal? In other words, I'm going to go into your kitchen and I'm going to eat your food here, but will you give me the $5 or whatever it was going to be? In those days, it was probably only a couple bucks. They never went for it, but it seemed logical to me. Well, look, if I'm willing to do without, I just saved you money, so give me that money instead. You know, I would just be nervy enough to say to my father, give me the inheritance. I'm one of those. Give me my inheritance now so that I can live on you the rest of the year or the rest of the time and do that. But you got to be a good manager of even the small amount. That's the test. And until you're willing to do that, you're going to find that you're going to miss out on much of what life has. I really believe this, that God's original plan for the people of God were to be richly blessed. When you go back and you look at what God said to Abraham, when he called him out of Babylon, called him out of Ur Chaldees, and said, go into this land that I would, and you read what God wanted to do with Abraham, it was very clear. What he was really saying, Abraham, if you're willing to leave all for me and go by faith, he said, all I'm going to give you now is the promise. But if you look at the promise, he says, I am going to bless you in every way. You're coming and you're going. I'm going to bless you above all the people of the earth. I mean, I'm going to bless you. And God had a reason for that. And I believe he still wants to do that to the people of God today. Not just so you can consume it upon yourself. Remember, Jesus talked about a fool in the Gospels. Big barns is all he thought about. I have been blessed with this great harvest, and I don't even have room to store it. Therefore, I'm going to tear down my barns, and I'm going to build bigger barns so that I can distribute this to those in need. Is that what he said? No, so I can consume it on myself, so that I may eat and drink and be merry. And Jesus called that kind of guy a fool. So, friends, if you're thinking that the answer to your problem is more, I would say begin to live within your means. Begin to live faithfully. Be a good steward of that small amount. If you think the answer, anyway, I was telling the story about myself. And I always thought that. I wanted to be rich. I wanted to have things. I wanted to be able to do that. And I was so mixed up as a little kid. But through that, God showed me that even though, here's the truth of the matter. There was a time in my life where I was making $500,000 a year. Do the math on that. $500,000 a year, over that. And I was still in debt. I was in debt. I was in debt to the IRS. That's probably why I had the $500,000, right? I was in debt. I owed money on credit cards. I had Carla. I had all of that. And, I had the nerve to, after I was blessed with those kind of resources, to think, if I could only make $1 million, if I could only make $1 million a year, then I'll get it straight. I was deceived. I mismanaged all the way up there. And I can tell you I don't make that today. I make a fraction of that today. But in that, well, come on, you probably don't know what a pastor makes. I make less than most of you in here. That's probably the truth. But the point is, I have learned that lesson, just that I'm talking about, being a good manager of that. I looked at my wife one day, and I was embarrassed because I did the finances. And I realized this isn't just me. This is my family that is living this way. And this is my church that I can't be as generous as I want to in God's work and all of that. And I just said, this has got to stop. And I made a covenant to God that I was going to be faithful to what he's given me. And all the way through that journey, I've gotten less and less every year. And that's how God has rewarded me, to show me, all right, you did good on that. Now I'm going to take away 20% and see what you can do. Next year I'm going to take away even more. And I know you can do it. And I felt as though he has cheered me on. And today I can say, by God's grace, I have learned to be a good steward of whatever I have. And you need to do that as well. You need to understand that. Well, as Jesus was facing the situation, he looked at his disciples. Again, a good teacher wants to quiz them. And Philip was the logical one, because we know Philip was from this area. Philip knew where the Get and Go's were. Well, you don't have Get and Go's here. The Quick Stops or the 7-Elevens or whatever. He knew where the Walmart was. I mean, he kind of knew where it was. I mean, you're thousands of people, and I've got to feed them. And so it's like he's the man. I mean, it's like Jesus turned to him. Jesus got a need, and he asked me. And he looks out over the crowd, and he looks out where he is, and he probably knows what Judas is carrying around in that little money sack. And he's thinking, almost a year's worth of wages is not enough to feed all these people. But the reality is, he didn't ask Philip so that Philip could solve the problem. He asked Philip because he wanted to know what Philip would do. And that's what it says here in verse 6. But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. That's comforting to me. Jesus knew what he was going to do. Jesus knew the end. He had already seen in his mind them sitting down, all those people sitting down and having a good meal. He saw that. He knew that would happen. And so it wasn't that he was seeking information. You know, a good attorney never asks a question, but he doesn't know the answer. And Jesus is like that. When Jesus asks me a question, it's not because he's seeking information. It's because he already knows what he's going to do. And the question is, what are we going to do? And so Philip kind of does the arithmetic, figures it all out, and man, he comes back with a discouraging report. He gives back to Jesus after assessing the problem. He's basically saying, there's no way. There's no way. There's no way, Jesus, you can do what you want to do. You better just cut your losses and send them on their way, and hopefully they can make it back to their homes. But the problem was that when Philip was looking at this, I wonder how many miracles Philip saw when he was standing right next to Jesus. I wonder how many times Philip was right there, part of that circle of 12, getting a front row seat to see what Jesus could do, to see the power that lie within this person. And how many times he probably walked away from those miracles going, wow, look what Jesus did. Wow, I'm so glad I'm a follower of his. I am honored to be in his presence. And then a new situation arises, and Philip has no faith. Philip assesses the situation based totally on what the flesh can see. You know, in our prayer circle group, powerful book. If you haven't read it, you should read it. One of my favorite phrases in there is Quail-mageddon. Quail-mageddon. And if you know the story of the children of Israel, they were out in the wilderness one time and they were hungry. And they were complaining. Actually, they weren't hungry. They were dissatisfied because there was probably manna being digested in their stomach when they were complaining. Because when God brings blessing in our life, and he brings it in such a consistent way, we begin to take it for granted, and all of a sudden, they're sick of this manna, and they want to eat meat. They want something that's even better than that, and they're complaining. And the Bible tells us that God brought in a quail storm. I mean, it could only be described as Quail-mageddon. We're talking about quail that's flying over and drops in front of the people. They don't even have to shoot them. They don't have to catch them. They don't have to trap them. I mean, these guys are flying over the children of Israel, and all of a sudden they get over there, and then like quail bombs, they are hitting the deck, and not only do they cover the ground, but what did we learn? About 3 feet high. Quail-mageddon. That's what our God can do. He can do those things. You never know when a storm is brewing and God is at work. And so he assesses this situation, even though he's seen a little bit about what God can do. But when he gives the report, here's what he did. He left Jesus out of it. When he said, Philip, what are we going to do? It was almost like, Philip, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? What are you and the disciples going to do? And almost like they left him out of the equation. And some of you, you might be saying, well, let's give Philip a break. Come on. He was put on the spot. But it was a test. It was a test. And when a teacher gives a test, there is a reasonable conclusion that the teacher should have that you've mastered this. We covered this. This was in your homework. This was being taught to you just the other day when this happened and that happened. So it wasn't completely out of the blue. Philip should have been able to assess the situation and come to the conclusion, well, there's no way that we could do this, but I know somebody who does. I know somebody who can. Jesus was looking for a faith response. A faith response. And I'm wondering how many times we find ourselves doing the same thing. We're faced with a situation where we know we've reached the end of our human capacity of whatever it is, whatever we're dealing with. Maybe it's your children, maybe it's your marriage, maybe it's your business, maybe it's whatever, and you're thinking, there is no way I can do this. The problem is, when we do that, we leave Jesus out of the equation. That's the problem the 10 spies had when they went over and spied out the land? They went out there and saw all that God said was true. All God promised was true. But there's challenges, there's problems, there's giants. It's a difficult land. It swallows up people. And they came back and they gave that report. They never once said, but God is with us. But God can do this. You know that one who provides our meal every morning? You know, it rained. They just probably thought that was a natural phenomenon, that food rained from heaven. You know, that's the problem that we find ourselves in. And so they left God out of the equation, and I believe that's exactly what faith did. Philip did. He wanted a faith response. It's too big for me. I don't have an answer, but I've seen what you can do. And I know, I'm going to throw it right back to you. God, I know you can feed these people. You know, just once I'd like for the disciples to do something like that. Put God on the spot. Tee it up. Tee up the miracle. And say, God, I know you could do this. As disappointing as Philip's response is, and as that thing is hanging in the air, you know, that's what he does. He kind of ends his report saying, we don't have enough money. There's no way this is going to happen. And as that's hanging in the air, Andrew comes to his rescue. And it's almost like Andrew's going to be the hero of the day. All right, Philip didn't do that well, but, you know, Andrew steps up, and he volunteers himself. You know, he's got some of Peter's blood in him. You know, Peter's the one that often spoke up and often did that. And Andrew is Andrew is Peter's brother. So, you know, they kind of probably both had that same inclination. And so Andrew steps up. He's going to save the day. He's going to hit the home run. He's going to be the hero. And so he says, well, Lord, there's a fella here, a little boy, and he's got a lunch. And I don't know if he brought it out and kind of pulled it out. Let's see what he got. And he pulls it out, and it's just a meager little lunch for a little kid. And so he says, this little lad here, this is what it says in verse 9. He said, there's a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. But what are they among so many? For a moment, it looks like he's going to be the hero of the day. If he had just stopped before that last phrase. There's a lad here who had 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. And I know you could take that and you could do something really amazing with it. But he doesn't. He adds that last phrase, but what are they? But what are they among so many? So close, and yet so far. I find myself making the same mistake they made. I do that too. And I know you do too. God is in the business. Here's what I've learned about my God, the God that deals with me, that's so patient, the God that's trying to teach me to be more like him every day. That very rarely does God just do stuff in my life without me being involved. He's a hands-on teacher. You know, there are some teachers that walk into a classroom and they stay behind their desk with a piece of chalk in their hands, and they just lecture, and that's it. And then there are some teachers that get out from behind the desk, and they walk among the students, and they watch what they're doing. And when they see something, or maybe a student's struggling, they walk up and they lean down, and they have a little conversation. They kind of coach them. They help them over the issue or the problem, or they take what they've already done, and they help them to go further. That sums up how God has worked in my life. I mean, there are those rare times when God sovereignly does something, and it's from start to finish, it's done before I ever am even aware of what happens. And I love it when that happens. But there are also many times when God asks me to be a part of the solution. You remember when Moses is standing on the mountain and God is telling him, you know, Moses, I got a plan for you. I'm going to send you back to Egypt. And you're going to go stand before Pharaoh. And you're going to tell him, give him a message from me. Tell him to let my people go. And Moses did just what all of us would do. Moses, you know, Lord, who am I? Who am I? Who am I to do that? You know what it's like when the nominating committee calls and they say they want you to be the teacher in the beginners. So they want you to be the teacher in the kindergarten, or even worse, the youth, early teens, all that. And you're thinking, just what Moses, But Lord, who am I? For 6 months now, we've been praying for a young adult leader. Have you noticed that? I know God's talking to some people, but they're not listening. You know what they're saying? Who am I, Lord? Who am I? And here's what God does. He did it to Moses, and he does it to all of us. What is this among so many? What he does is he usually asks the question, what's in your hand? What's in your hand? What can you bring to be part of the solution? God does that. You know, Moses had this stick. I don't know where this stick came from, this staff, but he probably found it out by the hillside when he was tending sheep and thought, you know what? That'd be a pretty good staff. I could work on that. I could shape that. I could maybe heat that up and bend that wood and make a crook and all of that, or whatever it might be. You know, he was a shepherd, you know, so you had to have a crook, even though the movies don't show that. I would imagine he kind of, you know, it was just a part of his life. It became an extension of him. You know, when Moses was sitting down, instead of getting up and turning the channel, he'd grab his stick and he would use it. It was a tool that had become a part of his life. But up to this point, it never did anything that really amazed him. And God says, what's in your hand? And Moses offers up that staff. God saw what that staff would do. God would teach Moses, I can use a dumb, inanimate piece of wood, even a dead one at that, and I can use it to do a miracle. How much more can God do with us? How much more could God work in our life? And so that's what we find. So the idea that Andrew had about this little boy, he's onto something. God likes to use what's already there. And so rather than looking for something that's outside your situation, begin to look at what's already in your hand. And what can I do? And how could I offer that to God to begin to do something? And so that's what the test was all about. God knew what he would do. The real question is, what would we do? I think before we leave Philip, going back to Philip, we need to really not let him off the hook that easy. Because just because everybody else is not in the picture, I think what the Lord really wanted Philip to understand is, I know feeding all these people looks impossible, but I want you to know that I can do the impossible. I want you to know, when this thing is ultimately done, it's really Philip and Andrew that had the biggest reward of it, because they kind of put themselves out there. And again, I just want to encourage you, because we're so quick to do this. When we are facing the challenges and the difficulties, we begin to assess them using our own resources, and we think, well, we're doing the best we can. And a lesson that I learned long ago is, for a Christian, you are not doing your best until you invite God into the situation. Until you invite God in, until you do that. And I think that's true in everything. And we try to model that here at the church. There is in everything we do, there is an element of faith. There's an element to that. When we start talking about our finances, we want God's blessing in there. We want to be able to move forward in faith and to do those things. And so if you're the kind of person that has to have everything worked out ahead of time before you're willing to move, you're going to miss out in the Christian life. You're going to stay with your engines revving like you're in neutral. You know, how impressive is that? You know, to be sitting in a hot rod that's got all kinds of power at your disposal, and you throw that thing in neutral and you're giving it the gas, and it sounds mean and it looks mean and it might intimidate anybody that would pull up next to you at the stoplight, but you're in neutral. You never engage the car, that power. And that's what God is saying, is that if you're that kind of person that you have to have everything worked out, you're going to miss out in life. The Christian life is meant to be filled with unexpected experiences that God brings to your life. And I know for some of you that scares you to death. You're not that kind of person. You like everything worked out. You like everything in the plan. You want to make a list of everything and have everything work out according to your plan, but that's not the way it's going to be. And that's what we see in this story. God is going to do something that's going to shake up this story. Jesus used this boy and his meager fare to prove an essential truth, and it's simply this, that God can work in a little. Too many of us think I got to have $1 gazillion for me to do anything significant for the Lord, but you don't. God can use even something little. The main question that we need to focus on is, based on what I have, is God in it? Is God in that? In my marriage is falling apart, don't give up until you say, has God been invited into this? Are we going to allow God? You got a troubled relationship with a teen, with a young person, you're estranged from somebody in your family, whatever it is, don't give up on that situation, even though you've seen nothing happen until you invite God in that. When you begin to invite God into the situation, suddenly the hopeless is now full of hope. I've seen this. One of the most practical things you can do in life is when resources are running low, be a good manager of what you have. There's a funny story here. It says a famous art collector was walking through the city when he noticed a mangy cat lapping milk from a saucer in a doorway of a store. He did a double take because he realized that that saucer was an extremely old and very valuable work of art. So he walked casually into the store and offered to buy the cat for $2. The store owner replies, "I'm sorry, but the cat isn't for sale." The collector continues, "Please, I need a hungry cat around the house to catch mice. I'll pay you $20 for that cat." The owner says, "Sold." And the money was exchanged for the cat. The collector continued, "Hey, for the $20 I just gave you, would you throw in that saucer? I mean, after all, the cat is used to it, and it's his food dish." The store owner replied, "Sorry, buddy, but that's my lucky saucers. So far this week, I've sold 68 cats." Some of you will get that later. Make good use of the resources that God has given to you. Here's the second thing. When resources are low, be thankful for what you have. That's what it says in verse 11. And Jesus took the loaves. I mean, when Andrew says, but what are they among so many? God didn't have that problem. He said, bring it to me. Bring me whatever you have. Don't withhold any piece of it, but with what that's there, we can do something. And so he invited them to surrender that to Christ. And then in verse 11 it says, and Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and to the disciples, to those sitting down, and likewise the fish, as much as they wanted. Jesus was doing what he always did, and what you and I should always do. And that is to be thankful. To be thankful for what you have. To be thankful for that which you have already been given. You know what? If you spend your whole life worrying about the stuff you don't have, all that it does is it makes you resent what you do have. You know what? I find people that are this way in life. They even have the nerve to say, boy, if I'd only married somebody better. I could have done better. And as I've put on, 10 or 12 years, I'm looking better than I did. I think I could do better than my wife or my husband or whatever else. And what happens is you're so worried about other things. And again, it's not just that. I mean, it's everything in life. It's this principle of not being grateful for what you have and wanting something more. And the problem is that when you're consumed with that, it makes you despise what you really have. You despise the job because you think you're not being paid enough. You think you deserve more. I used to go in, that was part of my business. As a business, I would go into other businesses and I would help break the business apart. I'd install some software, I'd train them, and so I worked with employees constantly. And I could never get over the fact, especially in one of my favorite areas. You want to know a lot about a person's character. Spend some time around a person that's working customer service, because you know how you feel when you talk to them. But seeing the other end of it, the ones that are taking the calls, the ones that are meeting with the customers and talking and trying to solve their problems. And I was always amazed at how hateful and angry these people were. As soon as they hung up the phone, they would usually make some commentary about that stupid person or this or that. And I'm thinking, whoa. Because of that person, you have a job. You know, and just people have this attitude that maybe at one time they were very thankful for the job that they had been given, but over time, when we start to want more and we want other things, that we become ungrateful for what God has given. And friends, this is a reality. That's why over and over and over in the Bible, God tells us, don't forget to be thankful. That when you have a heart filled with gratitude and thankfulness, it puts you in a place of blessing. When you are not a thankful person, I see very few people that live that kind of attitude where they are experiencing the blessing of God. Why would God bless them? If they're not going to give thanks for what they have, why would he want to bless them with more? And this is what 1 Corinthians 5, verse 18 says, in everything give thanks, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. Now, when he says everything, could that mean, that terrible job you have that you've got to fight to go into every morning and clock in? Could that be that marriage that you do have? That God has blessed you with somebody that's willing to put up with your shenanigans and to live with you in marriage? Is it your children? Is it whatever it is in life? Learn to be thankful. He says in everything that we are to be thankful. I may have shared this story, and I thank God I never received this kind of letter from my daughter. It says, Dear Mom and Dad, sorry I hadn't written sooner. My arm really had been broken. I broke it and my left leg when I jumped from the second story of the dormitory when we had the fire. We were lucky, though. A young service station attendant saw the blaze and called the fire department, and they were there in minutes. I was in the hospital for a few days, and because it was taking so long to get out of our dormitory to make it livable again, I moved in with that service station attendant. He's been so nice. Don't worry, we plan to get married as soon as his divorce is final, which should happen before the baby arrives. I hope things are fine at home. I'm doing fine. I will write more when I get a chance. Love, your daughter, Susie. P.S. None of the above is true, but I did get a C in sociology. Perspective helps you to be thankful, doesn't it? You know, the worst thing that happened to you this past week, you know what? You were still blessed. You were still blessed because it could always be worse. Sometimes we forget that. And that's why I think Jesus invites us as his children to mingle with others, to share our lives with other people, because when we get a taste of what their life is like, sometimes it helps us to be thankful for what we have. And so not everybody is living that blessed life that you want. Here's my advice. Stop worrying about stuff. Stop worrying about stuff. Stuff going to burn up one day, or a flood's going to take it away, or somebody's going to steal it. Isn't that what Jesus says? Stuff is just that. It's stuff. But as followers of God, we're called to be eternity people. You know that, right? We're called to be eternity people. We think in that dimension. We think in that concept. I'm not saying you disengage completely in the world. No. You engage in life. God wants to bless you, and he'll bless your faithfulness. But live with an attitude of thanksgiving, but also remember that what happens on this earth isn't the final thing. That there is something better and something far more significant that's going to happen. That's why Matthew chapter 6, verse 33 says, but seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Therefore, don't worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about its own things. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. We should put that as one of our Bible promises. Yeah. Stop worrying about that. Well, here's number 3, and that is don't neglect the needs of others. This is classic. You start running out, you start hoarding. That's what we do. We begin to do that. But you notice in the story, as Jesus is teaching and testing the disciples, He tested Philip, now he's going to teach them something. He's going to reinforce that objective about what it means to be a follower of God, inviting Jesus into his life. And Jesus teaches them a very simple principle. He says, give me that lunch. He took the lunch, he blessed it, he gave thanks for it. I wonder what the disciples were thinking when he was saying that prayer. Oh, Lord, bless this food. If I was Peter, I'd say, yeah, any better. But God was in the midst of a miracle. He was going to do a miracle, but notice what he does. He takes it and he gives it to the disciples. He could have done it in a more showy way, but he was teaching the disciples, you're going to be the one to hand out the miracle fish and the miracle bread. You're going to be the one. And while they may not, think about it, thousands of people, they didn't see what Jesus started with. I mean, they didn't know. Boy, where did all that food come from? They didn't know, but the disciples did. And God is teaching them that in this little, and I imagine after the prayer was over, he didn't have bucket loads. It looked the same. It wasn't the same, but it looked the same. And here are these 12 big, strong disciples. I think I've thought of this 100 times. Peter's hand had to be gigantic. He was a fisherman. When I get to heaven and Peter has a little dinky hand, I'm going to be disappointed. But I pictured this hand, this gnarly, huge hand of this sailor, this fisherman, holding it out there, getting a 12th of those fish. I mean, just his hand swallows it. And then the Lord looking at Peter and all the others saying, okay, you got it. Go feed them. What? Huh? You want us to do what? Yeah. The miracle was going to happen in their very hand. The miracle was going to happen in them giving it away, them serving others. They could have said, Lord, we're hungry too. This could be my snack. I mean, after all, we got to take care of ourselves. We need our strength. I mean, what happens when these people start falling over? Who's going to care for them? They could have said that, but they didn't. And Jesus was trying to teach them that in times when resources are low, don't neglect the needs of others. And so he teaches them this principle in Matthew chapter 20, verse 27, and whosoever desires to be first among you, let him be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to serve, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many. And that's what Jesus invited them to do, and I believe he invites us to do. Here's the last one. I'm going to have to skip over some stuff because we're running out of time, but here's the fourth one. Realize that God always has plenty left over for you. Look, when you don't have a lot, I know a lot of people think, "Whoa, boy, when I get more, I'm gonna give to people in need. I'm gonna give to my neighbors. I'm gonna give to my children. I'm gonna give to people. I'm gonna give to missions. I'm gonna give to the church. Whatever it is, you're thinking, when I get more, I'm gonna do that. And Jesus reminds us that no, be thankful for what you have. And part of that thankfulness is sharing that with someone else and trusting that God has enough left over for you. You know the end of the story. After everything is done, and after all of it has been given out, he teaches us a principle of stewardship. And that is, let nothing be wasted. When it's all said and done, those five barley loaves and 2 fish have multiplied to the place that everybody is filled and fed. There's 12 baskets of food left over. 12 baskets of food. And Jesus, who just made that happen, says, don't forget to pick that up. Don't forget. And as they walk away, after the people have fed, he sends them away, and the disciples are getting ready to go. And as they leave that place of instruction, they all carry a basket of miracle bread and some miracle fish. In fact, another gospel story, in one of the synoptic gospels, it says that they got into a boat. They got into a boat, and Jesus wasn't with them. He stayed back and was going to pray, and they found themselves in the midst of a storm. And God allowed them to take a basket of miracle fish with them to remind them that my power is greater than anything you've ever seen. And in life, sometimes storms come up, sometimes resources run low, but I can provide for your need. And I hope that you will learn that lesson as well, because all of us reach those times when we have lack. But our God ministers in those times and places where we lack. He provides. In your weakness, He is made strong.